Not every dangerous person raises a red flag. Some of the most dangerous ones raise your heart rate instead, with charm, with intensity, with a kind of magnetic certainty that makes you feel like you finally found someone who truly gets you. And on the other side of that same coin, some of the most dangerous patterns don't come from cruelty at all. They come from love that never learned where to stop. Today, we're going inside both sides of this. The narcissist whose danger hides in plain sight, and the empath whose danger hides inside their own good intentions. Because if you only know how to spot the obvious villain, you will walk straight past the ones who do the most damage. And if you only know how to protect yourself from others, you will never see the way your own patterns might be quietly destroying you from the inside. Let's start with the narcissist, because this is the one most people think they already understand. And it's exactly that overconfidence that gets people hurt. The most dangerous narcissists are almost never the loud ones. The version most people picture, arrogant, obviously self-centered, bragging without shame, is easy to spot and, frankly, easy to avoid. That's not who ends up doing the deepest damage. The most dangerous type is the one who leads with vulnerability, the one who tells you early, often within the first few conversations, about how badly they've been hurt before, how misunderstood they've always been, how they've built walls because the world kept proving those walls were necessary. This isn't a coincidence, and it isn't oversharing. It's reconnaissance. It's establishing, before you've had time to gather any real evidence about who they actually are, a story that will explain away every red flag you encounter later, because you'll already have a narrative ready-made to excuse it. They're just guarded because of what happened to them. They're just intense because they've been let down so many times. Watch for this pattern specifically. Someone who moves the relationship at a speed that should feel exciting but instead feels slightly disorienting. Declarations of a soulmate-level connection within weeks. A sense that you've been chosen, specially, out of everyone they've ever met, for a depth of understanding no one else has ever offered them. This is love bombing, and it is not a compliment to how special you are. It's a deliberate acceleration designed to bond you to them before your own judgment has time to catch up to the pace. The second sign, and this one is subtler, is what happens the very first time you disappoint them. Not betray them, simply disappoint them in some small, human, completely ordinary way. Cancel a plan, disagree with an opinion, need something from them instead of only giving. Watch the reaction closely, because this is diagnostic in a way almost nothing else is. Does the disappointment get processed like a normal human emotion, mild frustration, a conversation, resolution, or does it trigger something disproportionate, cold withdrawal, a sudden reframing of you as selfish or ungrateful, a punishing silence that lasts far longer than the offense could possibly justify? That gap between the size of what happened and the size of their reaction is one of the most reliable warning signs that exists. Healthy people have proportional responses. Dangerous ones do not. The third sign is the one most empaths miss longest because it's disguised as intimacy, the slow, incremental erosion of your outside world. It rarely happens through an obvious demand. It happens through 1,000 small comments. A friend who's described as not a good influence, a family member who doesn't really understand your relationship, a hobby that starts feeling selfish to prioritize because it takes time away from them. None of these, individually, sound like control. Together, over months, they function as isolation. And isolation is one of the oldest, most effective tools of control that exists, precisely because it doesn't announce itself as control at all. It announces itself as closeness. And the fourth, perhaps the most dangerous sign of all, because it hides behind a compliment, they tell you repeatedly how different you are from everyone else they've ever been with, how real you are, how you're the only one who's ever truly understood them. This flatters exactly the part of an empath that most wants to believe it. the part that has always felt a little too sensitive, a little too much, in a world that rarely rewards depth of feeling. Being told you're the exception, the rare one, the person capable of loving someone that no one else could handle, it feels like being chosen. What it actually is, in this pattern, is being cast. You're being assigned a role in someone else's story, the special one, the patient one, the one who won't leave the way everyone else did. And roles like that come with obligations nobody ever explicitly states out loud until you're already too deep inside the story to easily walk away. Now, here's where this gets uncomfortable because it's the part almost no one talks about in this niche, the part that flips the lens back around. Because empaths are not automatically safe simply by virtue of being empaths. There is a version of empathy that becomes dangerous too, not to other people most of the time, but to the empath themselves. And understanding this version is just as important as understanding the narcissist, because it's often what makes the empath vulnerable to the narcissist in the first place. The first dangerous pattern in an unhealed empath is what's sometimes called compulsive helping, an inability to witness someone else's distress without immediately trying to fix it, soothe it, or absorb it, regardless of whether it's actually your responsibility to do so. This sounds like generosity. It often is generosity, at least at first. But taken far enough, it becomes something closer to self-erasure, a pattern where your own needs, your own limits, your own legitimate exhaustion get consistently deprioritized in favor of managing someone else's emotional state. And here's the part that makes it dangerous rather than simply inconvenient. People who are dangerous to you can sense this pattern almost immediately, and they will use it consciously or not as the exact door they need to walk through. The second dangerous pattern is chronic self-blame disguised as accountability. A genuinely self-aware person can look honestly at their role in a conflict. An unhealed empath often does something different. They reflexively absorb blame regardless of the actual facts because taking responsibility, even unearned responsibility, feels safer and more familiar than the discomfort of holding someone else accountable. This pattern doesn't just make you easier to manipulate. It actively recruits you into managing the very dynamics that are hurting you because you've been conditioned to believe that if something is going wrong, the answer must be something you need to change a bow. The third dangerous pattern is one that almost never gets named directly because it's wrapped so tightly in something that looks like virtue. The inability to let people experience the natural consequences of their own behavior. An unhealed empath will often intervene again and again to soften a blow that was supposed to teach someone something. They'll make the excuse to the friend group before the narcissist has to face the fallout themselves. They'll pay the bill, cover the shift, smooth over the argument, quietly absorb the fallout of someone else's poor choices so consistently that the other person never actually has to reckon with the cost of their own behavior. This isn't kindness in its purest form anymore, even though it started as kindness. It's a kind of enabling that comes from a genuinely loving place. And that origin doesn't make it any less corrosive, both to the relationship and to the empath doing it. Because every time you absorb a consequence that wasn't yours to absorb, you're not just protecting someone. You're removing the single most reliable teacher a person has access to, the natural result of their own actions. The fourth dangerous pattern is the hardest one to see from the inside because it disguises itself as depth of feeling rather than a flaw. The inability to trust your own perception once someone you love disputes it. This is different from healthy open-mindedness. Being willing to consider you might be wrong is a good quality. What we're talking about here is something more corrosive, a reflexive, almost automatic surrender of your own memory, your own read of a situation. The moment someone you're emotionally invested in tells you that you're misremembering, overreacting, or missing context. An empath with strong internal boundaries can hold two things at once: genuine openness to being wrong and genuine confidence in what they actually witnessed. An empath without that boundary collapses the second one the moment it's challenged. And that collapse is precisely what makes gaslighting so devastatingly effective on exactly the people who should, in theory, be the hardest to fool because they feel and notice everything. Here's what makes this particularly dangerous when it intersects with a narcissist. These two patterns don't just coexist, they interlock. A narcissist's disproportionate reactions require someone willing to overfunction around them, to smooth things over, to take the blame reflexively so the relationship doesn't have to confront what's actually happening. An unhealed empath provides exactly that, not because they're weak, but because their empathy has no boundary telling it when to stop. And a narcissist's love bombing works precisely because it targets a specific hunger, to be seen as exceptional, to be chosen, to finally matter enough to someone that they won't leave the way everyone else seems to. An unhealed empath, especially one who has spent a lifetime feeling too sensitive for a world that rewards detachment, is exactly the person most susceptible to that particular hook. This is why the healthiest relationships and the healthiest version of any individual person require something that sounds almost contradictory at first. Empathy with an edge, compassion with a spine, the capacity to feel deeply for someone while still holding a clear, unmovable line about what you will and will not accept, what is and isn't your responsibility to fix, and what consequences you will allow other people to face without stepping in to soften them. So, how do you actually tell the difference in yourself and in the people you're evaluating between the healthy version of each type and the dangerous one? There's a single reliable test that cuts through almost all of the confusion, and it applies to both narcissists and empaths alike, because in both cases the answer reveals the same underlying truth. For the narcissist, what happens when they don't get their way and there's no audience watching? Not the version of the reaction they perform when other people can see it. The private version, the one that surfaces when they think the consequences of the reaction won't cost them anything socially. If that private version is calm, proportional, and capable of actual repair, a real apology, real behavior change over time, not just words offered to end the discomfort of being confronted, you're likely dealing with someone who has ordinary human flaws, not a dangerous pattern. If that private version is punishing, disproportionate, or designed to make you responsible for managing their emotional state, you're looking at exactly the pattern this entire story has been describing. For the empath, what happens when you say no and there are no immediate consequences for saying it? No one gets upset, no relationship is on the line, nothing bad happens as a direct result. Do you feel relief, a clean and simple sense of having honored your own limit? Or do you feel a low-grade dread, a compulsive urge to over-explain, apologize, or find some way to soften the no into something more palatable, even when nobody asked you to? That gap tells you almost everything about whether your empathy currently has a working boundary attached to it, or whether it's operating the way it did before you ever learned it needed one. Neither of these patterns in either type is a permanent sentence. Narcissistic patterns exist on a spectrum, and while the deepest end of that spectrum is notoriously resistant to change, movement toward health is not impossible for everyone who exhibits these traits. It's simply rare, and it requires a willingness to sit in discomfort that most people at that end of the spectrum have spent a lifetime avoiding. And the empath's dangerous patterns are, in a strange way, more within your own control than almost anything else in this entire story because they were learned, which means they can be unlearned slowly, deliberately, with practice that doesn't always feel natural at first. Ut yourself. This is the part of the story that matters most because it's the part you actually have power over. You cannot make a narcissist develop a proportional response to disappointment. You cannot make them tolerate accountability without collapsing into performed devastation designed to redirect the conversation back toward comforting them. You cannot force insight into someone whose entire identity is organized around avoiding it. That work, if it ever happens at all, has to come from inside them, usually only after consequences finally become too loud to explain away, and even then, there's no guarantee. That was never yours to control, and continuing to believe it might be is one of the most exhausting, most common traps an empath falls into again and again with person after person, hoping that this time, with enough patience, enough love, enough perfectly worded explanation, the pattern will finally break. What you can control, what was always actually within your reach the entire time, is your own side of the equation, the compulsive helping, the reflexive self-blame, the inability to let someone else's consequences land where they belong instead of quietly redirecting them onto yourself. The collapse of your own perception the instant someone disputes it. These are not character flaws that define you permanently. They are learned patterns, usually built early, usually built for good reasons at the time, as survival strategies in environments where being needed felt safer than simply being, where smoothing things over kept the peace in a household or a relationship, where conflict felt genuinely dangerous. They made sense once. They may have even kept you safe once, but a pattern that was protective in one context can become the exact vulnerability that gets exploited in another, and recognizing that difference is not a betrayal of the person you used to be. It's an evolution of them. Here is what healing this actually looks like in practice, because it's rarely dramatic and almost never happens in a single decisive moment. It looks like noticing the urge to fix someone else's feelings and, just once, letting the discomfort of not fixing it sit there instead, unresolved, without rushing to smooth it over. It looks like catching yourself mid-apology for something that was never your fault, and stopping the sentence before it finishes. It looks like holding a boundary through the uncomfortable middle part, the part where the other person is upset and you have no evidence yet that anything bad will happen, only the old, familiar fear that it might. Most people who develop real, lasting boundaries didn't do it by reading the right sentence at the right moment. They did it by living through that uncomfortable middle part enough times to discover, slowly, that the catastrophe they'd been bracing for their entire life mostly doesn't arrive. And once that boundary starts to hold, once your empathy has an actual edge to it instead of an open door with no lock, something remarkable happens to how you experience the world around you. Dangerous people, the ones with the disproportionate reactions and the love-bombing timelines and the subtle isolation tactics, start to register faster and more clearly because the very thing that used to make you vulnerable to them, an inability to trust your own read on a bad feeling, is exactly the thing you've been rebuilding. You start noticing the speed of the connection before you're 3 months deep in it. You start feeling the disproportion in a reaction before you've had time to explain it away. You start recognizing the particular flavor of being told you're the only one who's ever really understood them for what it actually is. Not a compliment, but a role being handed to you with strings already attached. This is what makes the whole picture come full circle, because the two halves of this story were never actually separate. The dangerous narcissist and the dangerous boundaryless empath are not two unrelated topics. They are two halves of the exact same dynamic, each one built to interlock perfectly with the other. A narcissist's disproportionate need for control finds its match in an empath's disproportionate need to smooth things over. A narcissist's hunger to be seen as exceptional finds its match in an empath's hunger to finally, deeply be needed by someone. Understanding one without understanding the other leaves you only half protected, able maybe to spot the wolf, but still standing in the open field wondering why wolves keep finding you. Healing both halves at once is what actually changes the pattern. Not becoming cold, not becoming someone who no longer feels deeply. The world does not need less empathy in it, and neither do you. What it needs, what you need, is empathy that finally knows where it ends. compassion that can hold someone's pain without absorbing their consequences, a heart open enough to still believe in people, and a spine strong enough to walk away from the ones who prove again and again that they were never going to meet you halfway. That combination, depth without collapse, feeling without self-erasure, isn't something you're born with. Almost no one is. It's something you build slowly, one honored boundary at a time, one unfixed feeling at a time, one moment of trusting your own perception, even when someone you love insists you shouldn't. And once you've built it, the wolves stop finding you nearly as easily as they used to. Not because you got lucky, because you finally quietly stopped being an easy field to hunt in.